Welcome to the video where we discuss the various corporate stakeholders who exist within and around companies, as well as some basic ideas of corporate governance before we proceed with a more detailed study of this topic in further on videos. So let's begin with the idea or the notion of corporate stakeholders. Please notice the subtle difference between stakeholders and shareholders, actually. So a stakeholder is any individual or indeed a group with what we call a vested interest in the company. Now, of course, when we think about those who have an interest in the company, we typically think about investors, both shareholders and the holders of a company's debt or the providers of a company's debt. But the list extends, beyond. I was going to say not just the investors, but I guess I can say this. And let's think about some potential stakeholders. Of course, I guess any list will probably begin with the investors, both the equity investors, so the actual owners of the business, but also the providers of debt funding. We also have, and we will sort of distinctly discuss this, the board of directors. And by the way, we spent the previous video, or devoted the previous video to a discussion of the position and interests of the equity and debt investors. So we will be saying a bit less about this in this specific video. Now, the board of directors, something we'll discuss in more detail. This is a body which sort of supervises the company's activities, although there are different models of the BOD. It depends on where you are in the world, how this actually works. Then separately to the board of directors, we've got the management. So actual executives whose job it is to execute the strategies, implement the strategies. That's why we call them executives, developed by the board, developed by the board of directors. Although once again, how this actually functions depends on jurisdiction. And these people are typically in charge of running the company's operations on a day-to-day basis, run the operations of the business. So, the management would be people like the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, chief operations officer, etc. The so-called C-suite. So people whose job description often begins with the letter C, standing for chief. And of course, beyond this, we also have employees who are very much who have an interest in the well-being of the business. We've got the company's customers who are also stakeholders. We've got the company's suppliers, of course, and we also have the government, be it national, federal, or local government, who probably also has an interest in the business, especially if it's an important employer and an important part of the overall local economy. And you could really extend this list to, include any individual group that is in some way affected by the company. Okay. So these are stakeholders. What about the idea or the notion of corporate governance? Corporate governance falls under, there are two ways that your book discusses of looking at this, namely the shareholder theory of corporate governance, In other words, how decisions are made within the business, whose interests are we supposed to serve as a company, and then there is the alternative, so-called stakeholder theory of corporate governance. Holder theory of corporate governance. And really the distinction or the difference boils down to what we think the company is there to achieve. Under this view, the shareholder theory of corporate governance, which is kind of the more classic capitalist theory of how companies are run and for whose benefit they are run, the board of directors elects management, who will be executing the strategy set out by the board of directors. And basically management are the people who come to work every day and run the whole thing, right? Run the operations of the business. And the whole idea is that the elected managers elects management who serve the interests of shareholders. So we do whatever is needed so as to increase shareholder value and do the right thing by the shareholders. And I guess you could say, as a side effect of this, that the interests of other stakeholders, so people like employees, suppliers, customers, the surrounding community within which you are based, of other stakeholders, are only going to be relevant to the extent that they affect shareholder value. So we do whatever is needed to increase shareholder value. And I mean, if that happens to align with the interest of other stakeholders, fine. If it doesn't, well, tough. Although, obviously, we have to act within certain sort of limits of law, environmental regulation, etc. Now, the stakeholder theory of corporate governance is all about trying to balance the interests and needs of various stakeholder groups. So here, all stakeholder groups, all stakeholder interests, at least should be considered. And in some way balanced, not just the interests of the shareholders. And this theory gained a lot of popularity. I remember this happening a lot in the 1990s, early 2000s. It was, I was studying finance at that time, and I happened to live in the north of Europe, in the Nordic country, in Scandinavia, and this theory of stakeholder management was very much, corporate governance was very much promoted back then as being a viable alternative to the sort of more American-centric shareholder theory of corporate governance. There was a lot of hype surrounding this approach. It is often, this approach, often associated with something that we will be discussing at great length in subsequent videos, namely ESG. So, environmental, social, governance factors being considered by investors and by management. Although it has to be said that while it is a very appealing theory, right, to consider the interests of all stakeholder groups, it does come with its unique set of challenges or even obstacles. First of all, however, let's say fair and inclusive and egalitarian this may sound, the question remains, a lot of the time the interests of the different stakeholders are going to be opposing. So how do you balance, how to balance competing, contradictory, competing objectives or interests of the different stakeholder groups. How to, let's say, sometimes even define and quantify and measure non-shareholder objectives. I mean, in order to track performance along some goal, it would be good to quantify it, make it, make it measurable. And some of these goals of the wider stakeholders are difficult to effectively measure and quantify without making things too simple. Especially this goes, especially when you consider environmental goals, for example, or social goals. How do you measure that? The other problem is that if you as a company try to adhere to this model, right, of stakeholder corporate governance, or considering the stakeholder theory of corporate governance, what about your competitors? What if others do not follow the same approach? If others do not have similar, let's say, constraints, trying to do the right thing by the maximum number of groups, will the company remain competitive? Will we remain competitive? And the answer often is, it's very difficult to remain competitive when others are acting without regard for the various stakeholder interests. Now, I'm not saying that's the right thing, but it does ultimately come down to competitiveness and whether you can indeed sell your products or offer your services. And there is, very much a cost, the cost of adhering to ESG standards. Treating your employees well, fairly, sourcing from sustainable places, or places where things are grown or harvested or mined sustainably, it does come with a very sort of tangible cost. And the question is, can you pass that on to your client? It may seem like so, but then the question is, will your clients really not go for the cheaper product that is not so sustainable? Right. Well, these are open questions. Obviously, your book tries to provoke this kind of thinking, and it's a very let's say realistic process that goes on in many businesses. Now, let's think about the different stakeholder groups. As I said, in the previous video, we already had a pretty good look at investors, the providers of debt and equity funding. So here, your curriculum, while obviously mentioning equity investors and debt investors, does devote a little bit more attention to debt, and making the difference or differentiating between those who provide private debt, so private debt holders, and public debt holders. When I say public debt holders, what I actually refer to are those people who hold bonds issued by the company, which are typically publicly traded, right? They can be bought pretty much by anybody, at least often that is the case, bondholders. And there is a big difference between the amount of information that these two groups are sort of privy to, or that they can access. You see, the holders of publicly traded securities, including bonds, they have to rely on, on public information, publicly available information. And to be honest, they also have relatively little influence over the company. Unless the company gets into trouble and is unable to service the debt and tries to get consent for some kind of debt restructuring, in which case it will have to really talk to the bondholders and try to, get them get those bondholders on the company's side or the management side to agree to some restructuring. Other than that sort of extreme situation, normally when things go according to plan, bondholders have very little sway or have very little to say about how the company is being run. On the other hand, the holders or the private holders of debt, the holders of private debt, for example, banks who extend loans to the company, credit to the company, or offer, leases, which are often offered via companies that belong to bank groups. These people typically, or these types of institutions, typically hold their debt all the way to maturity. Of course, if you've studied fixed income, you'll know all about turning debt into various kinds of asset-backed securities, like mortgage-backed securities. But in a corporate context, this is typically debt which is held to maturity, and especially banks will typically have access to non-public information. How do they have access to this? Well, typically because when a company borrows from a specific bank, it's quite normal that it also has its cash deposits and all of its sort of accounts at the same institution. So a bank will have access to much more information, especially early warning signs that something may be going wrong. For example, the company is depleting its cash balance, its account balance, and actually banks have much better access to management. Management will typically talk to the bankers with the management of the bank which the company is using for its day-to-day operations, as well as loans and credit, and they'll try to keep good relations. So especially in the case of smaller and medium-sized businesses, at smaller, medium-sized businesses, the private lenders, especially banks, may have a big influence on the company. And quite famously, it's always been said that, especially for example, in Germany, over here in Europe, banks have traditionally held very good, close relationship with the so-called Mittelstand. These are the medium and small-sized business, especially medium-sized businesses, for which Germany is quite famous for, and those kinds of businesses rely extensively on private debt coming from the banking sector, but that does require keeping good relationships with bank and being open to the bank's suggestions and, I guess, influence over how a company is run. Maybe not on a day-to-day basis, but kind of in the long run indeed. Right. The providers of debt will therefore face less so-called information asymmetry. The providers, of course, of private debt, not public debt, asymmetry, than would be the case to equity holders compared to holders of public equity. In the sense that a bank will know a lot more about what's going on at a company on an ongoing basis than a shareholder just holding some shares which they bought on a stock exchange. Okay, now to a very important discussion concerning a critical stakeholder group, namely the board of directors. This is where we get to discuss the different models of how the board of directors is actually set up. So the BOD, the board of directors, now this body is elected by actual shareholders, at the AGM, annual general meeting of shareholders. They vote on who should take a seat on the so-called board. And the BOD, in a sort of classic sense, has executives, and its job is to monitor the performance of the company and its management team. Now, there are in fact two types of directors who may sit on the board. Your book calls them inside directors, although depending on on the source that you read on this topic, I'm presenting this as it is presented in the book, in the curriculum. If you read from some other source, you may find different terms being used. As I said, it is very also jurisdiction specific. So inside directors would be people like the founders of the company, those who originally set it up, but also current and former managers. And there are also going to be so-called independent directors. And these are people who have no, let's say, material connection with the business, but they've been invited and selected to join the board, often, with because of their vast experience in commerce, in finance, in industry, and it's thought that these independent directors are often much better at representing the interests of, especially of smaller and minority shareholders, whereas the insiders, especially the founders, will principally be will mainly be concerned about their own interests, which are those of big shareholders. So these guys typically better represent, at least that's the theory, the interests of smaller stroke minority shareholders. Now, I think that's enough for the theory. Now for those two models of how the board may work. In countries like the USA and the UK, these being the two most predominant countries where you'll find this approach, we find what's known as the single tier board. So you effectively have one board of directors, and that board of directors consists of the sort of the inside directors and the independent directors. Often there are recommendations, for example, that there should be a majority of independent directors, but that is going to be very country specific. Now, in many other places, including where I come from, and generally in Central Europe, but also Eastern Europe, we have what's known as the two-tier model. And a good representative of a country that has that kind of model would be Germany, which I've already mentioned. And this is very popular in many continental European countries, or countries on the continent. The two-tier model, the name comes from the fact that the board of directors isn't sort of a single body like over here, a single blob or a bubble. What you have is actually a separate supervisory board And kind of below it, we typically draw what's known as the actual board of directors, but it's not the same type of body that you saw on the left-hand side. The board of directors here is supervised by the supervisory board. So this body up here, this one is composed of independent directors. Independent directors sitting over here only. And often, especially in places like Germany, this will even be mandated by law. They often representing different stakeholder groups. Stakeholders. Actually, some Scandinavian countries also have this required by law, at least used to, right? That there would, for example, have to be mandatorily a representative of the employees on the supervisory board. And other stakeholder groups, obviously employees, shareholders, etc. Now, the job of the supervisory board is, as the name suggests, to carry out supervision, carry out oversight, and among their function is that they may both appoint as well as dismiss actual directors, so the people who occupy this spot over here. Now, the board of directors is the body that is actually responsible for strategy setting, but also day-to-day sort of management oversight. Hence, all those functions would be present in the single board of directors body that you'll find in the USA or in the UK, whereas in other places, I think a great example to remember if you want one country to focus on would be Germany, is you're going to have to break it up. And very often, especially in Germany, I used to work in Germany for some time, you would have an employee representative on the board. As far as I remember, from a couple of some years ago, that would also have been the case, for example, in Sweden, that there should be an employee representative on the board. How do we actually go about electing the board? Now, this is another topic which you need to know a little bit about. In most cases, so let's say mostly, all board members are elected simultaneously at the same time. And, typically for what would be either or 1 year or a 2-year term on the board. However, sometimes, or in some countries, or at some companies, you'll find that the board is described as what's known as a staggered board. Okay, a staggered board. So instead of electing all the directors, all the board members in one go, once a year or once every 2 years, you elect groups of directors who get elected in consecutive years. So the way we would typically portray this, and this is what your book does as well, is it draws little blocks that look like this. We elect one group, let's say for 2 years, or I don't know, let's say 3 years, right? Next year we elect another group for some term in office. Then we elect another group. In that way, the effect is, and this is actually common, I've written down in my notes, in Australia, that's what your book says, but also in some European countries. The effect of this, is such that it takes a longer time for the whole board to be replaced by new candidates. So it takes, I've written, some time to replace the board fully with new directors, which has its pluses and minuses, right? It ensures some level of continuity. And let's say longer term thinking is encouraged in this way instead of short-termism, which is what many corporations are accused of. Longer term thinking is encouraged this way. But also, I mean, the downside is that, especially if a company that gets taken over following a takeover, the acquirer will have more of an obstacle to get the board aligned with their interests because of that staggered nature. I mean, is that a good thing or bad thing? We can argue, but these are the two effects. Taking for a potential acquirer, the fact that it takes a longer time to replace the board with their own candidates will be a downside. But on the other hand, maybe the employees of the company will be happy that there will be some continuity from the previous times, at least for 1 or 2 years to come. Now, among the groups of stakeholders that we initially mentioned, we also had the company's management, so the managers and other groups as well here. So let me just say make a few points about managers of the business. The managers include the company's chief executive officer, so kind of the chief person running the company on a day-to-day basis, who reports to the board of directors. Their job is essentially to develop and implement some corporate strategy. And they do this, of course, under the oversight of the board of directors. And they are going to be responsible for the day-to-day running of the business, day-to-day operations, naturally. What's also important is that senior managers typically receive their compensation in more than one way. They typically receive what we call their base salary, which is what flows to their bank account every month. So that's the cash payment they receive on a monthly basis, I guess. And then on top of that, they are typically eligible to receive a bonus. That bonus will take the form of sometimes cash, but also typically coupled with shares of the business. So shares, and also there's typically going to be a long-term, spanning multiple years, a multi-year share-based incentive plan. Share-based incentive plan where these shares are awarded, or the awards vest, become fully eligible, provided the manager doesn't leave too soon, but also that certain objectives are achieved. And this is a very sort of common way to align the interests of managers with those of shareholders. Because if you award the managers shares of the company, it's also in their interest to do whatever they can to make that share price grow with the interests of shareholders. Of course, that doesn't necessarily do anything for the interests of the other stakeholders, like the employees, the government, the community. But this is a reflection of, I guess, the shareholder theory of governance being the dominant model. Now, as I said, your book also lists and also discusses employees, customers, suppliers, and governments. Of course, employees, some of them also may receive share-based compensation, or may receive some stock options, for example, that are tied to the performance of a company's shares to encourage them to do what's right by the shareholders and their wealth. To be honest, there is nothing at all, I think, surprising or new or anything worth repeating here in those little paragraphs on those additional stakeholder groups. So I am not going to talk about it because it's so obvious why suppliers should care about a company to whom they supply, why customers should may be interested in the fate of a company, and why governments that collect corporate taxes from business would also be interested in the health and future of a company operating under their jurisdiction. So I'm not going to waste our time discussing this. If you want to have a look in the book, but I guarantee you that you will not find that anything that would surprise you there.